cold leather pressed against her cheek. Zip ties bit into her wrists, smelling faintly of engine grease and old tobacco. She wasn't supposed to be in the back of this armored sedan. She was a bookkeeper, a quiet nobody who worried about electricity bills and stale bread. But the terrifying man who dragged her out of the alley didn't care. He looked into her terrified eyes with a lethal, exhausted familiarity and whispered, "Welcome home, dear wife." She isn't his wife. Footsteps echoed in the narrow, garbage-strewn alley behind the diner. Fiona hugged her thin cardigan tighter against the November chill, her keys wedged between her knuckles, a pathetic, useless defense mechanism she'd read about in a magazine. The air smelled of rotting cabbage and the metallic tang of impending snow. She just wanted to get to the subway. She just wanted to go home, soak her blistered feet, and eat leftover pasta straight from the Tupperware. A hand clamped over her mouth. It didn't feel like a mugger's panicked grab. It was methodical, heavy, and stank of expensive vetiver and gunpowder. Fiona screamed, but the sound died against a thick leather glove. Another arm, entirely composed of rigid muscle and tailored wool, banded around her waist, lifting her off the wet pavement. Her cheap sneakers kicked at empty air. Panic, raw and violently cold, seized her chest. She twisted, thrashing her elbows backward, connecting with something solid. A low, vibrating grunt sounded in her ear. "Still fighting, Fallon, even now." Fallon. The name froze the blood in Fiona's veins. It was her sister's name. Her twin sister. The sister she hadn't seen in 6 years, the one who had vanished into the high-end, shadowy underbelly of the city, while Fiona stayed behind to pay off their mother's medical debts. Before Fiona could shake her head, before she could force out a muffled, "You have the wrong girl," a heavy cloth was pressed over her nose. Chloroform was a myth of old movies. This was something chemical, sharp and instantly nauseating. The alley tilted. The neon sign of the diner bled into a singular, blinding red streak. Then there was only the suffocating smell of the rag and the terrifyingly calm heartbeat of the man holding her. She woke to the rhythmic, hypnotic thump of tires rolling over smooth asphalt. Fiona's head throbbed with a vicious intensity, a dull spike of pain localized right behind her left eye. She groaned, shifting her weight. Her wrists were bound in front of her with thick plastic zip ties, the edges already chafing her skin raw. She was lying sideways across the spacious back seat of a moving vehicle. The leather beneath her was buttery and pristine, entirely at odds with the dirt and grease staining her jeans. "I see the sedative wore off faster than anticipated. Your tolerance is always a marvel." The voice came from the opposite side of the car. It was a baritone drawl, smooth but edged with a quiet, terrifying violence. Fiona blinked against the dim lighting, pushing herself up to a sitting position. Her stomach rolled. She swallowed back a surge of bile and looked at her captor. He was sitting in the corner of the seat, one leg crossed over the other, casually scrolling through a smartphone. The screen illuminated his features. Sharp jawline, a straight aristocratic nose, and eyes that were impossibly dark, like looking into the bottom of a dry well. He wore a dark charcoal suit that screamed custom tailoring, a stark contrast to the brutal, bruising grip he'd used in the alley. "Hoo-hoo," Fiona started, her voice coming out as a dry, pathetic rasp. She cleared her throat, terror vibrating in her vocal cords. "Who are you?" "You've made a mistake." The man locked his phone and dropped it onto the seat beside him. The sudden lack of light made the shadows in the car feel heavier. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them. The smell of vetiver washed over her again, making her stomach clench. "A mistake," he repeated softly. He reached out. Fiona flinched violently, pressing her back against the door. His hand paused in the air, his lips curling into a humorless smile. His fingers bypassed her face, catching a strand of her dyed, mousy brown hair. He rubbed the strands between his thumb and forefinger with open disgust. "The dye job is atrocious, Fallon. Brown doesn't suit you. And the clothes." He dragged his dark eyes over her frayed cardigan and sensible, orthotic-friendly sneakers. "Playing the impoverished civilian? Was this your grand escape plan, to bore me to death?" "I'm not Fallon," Fiona said. She forced herself to look him in the eye. "My name is Fiona. I am her sister." The man stared at her. For 3 seconds, the only sound was the hum of the engine and the friction of the tires. Then he laughed. It wasn't a warm sound. It was a short, sharp exhalation of breath that held zero amusement. "A sister," he murmured. "Fascinating. We've been married for 3 years, and you never mentioned a twin. You're losing your touch, my love. This is desperate, even for you." "Call my employer," Fiona pleaded, desperation cracking her facade. "I work at the accounting firm on 5th and Main. Ask for Mr. Henderson. He'll tell you. I've been there for 4 years. Please just check." He moved so fast she didn't have time to blink. His large hand wrapped around her jaw, fingers biting into her cheeks. He didn't squeeze hard enough to break bone, but the threat of it was absolute. His face was inches from hers. Up close, she could see the exhaustion etched into the corners of his eyes, a deep-seated weariness that mirrored the violence in his posture. "Let's get one thing straight," he whispered, the words scraping against the quiet interior of the car. "You stole $3 million from my personal vault. You shot my head of security in the kneecap. And you vanished for 4 months. You do not get to play games anymore, Fallon. If you open your mouth to lie to me again, I won't wait until we get to the house to remind you who you belong to." He released her, shoving her slightly so her head bumped against the window. Fiona sat frozen. $3 million. A man shot. Married. Fallon wasn't just in the underworld. Fallon was at the top of it, and she was married to a man who looked like he could snap necks for a morning workout. If she kept denying it, he would think she was mocking him. If he thought she was mocking him, the promises in his dark eyes would become reality. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the ribs, knocking the air from her lungs. She couldn't reason with a monster who thought she was an equal monster. To survive the night, she had to be Fallon. She had to be the woman who could shoot a man in the knee and walk away with $3 million. Fiona forced her breathing to slow. She pulled her shoulders back, ignoring the trembling in her spine. She looked out the tinted window, watching the city lights blur into the dark trees of the suburbs, and began the terrifying mental calculus of becoming her sister. The car tires left smooth asphalt and crunched onto heavy gravel. Through the tinted glass, Fiona saw wrought-iron gates swinging open, revealing a driveway flanked by ancient, skeletal oaks. At the end of the winding path sat a sprawling stone manor, its windows glowing with a harsh, yellow light that offered no warmth. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress. The vehicle rolled to a stop beneath a portico. The driver, a hulking man with a thick neck and a ruined nose, immediately stepped out and opened the rear door. "Out!" her captor commanded. Fiona slid clumsily across the leather, her bound hands making balance difficult. As her sneakers hit the gravel, the cold night air bit through her thin cardigan. The man emerged behind her. He didn't grab her arm or drag her. He simply stood too close, a silent, oppressive wall of muscle and expensive fabric, directing her toward the heavy mahogany front doors. "Cut these off," Fiona said. Her voice wavered. She cleared her throat, biting her tongue to draw a sharp point of pain to focus on. She tried again, aiming for flat and demanding. "Cut these off, now. He paused, glancing down at her wrists. A slow, cynical smirk touched his mouth. He pulled a folding knife from his pocket with a metallic snick that made her stomach drop. He stepped in, catching her bound hands in one of his. The blade slid beneath the plastic with practiced ease. He twisted, and the zip tie snapped. "Better?" he asked, his tone dripping with patronizing calm. Fiona rubbed her raw wrists, hiding her shaking hands by crossing her arms over her chest. She didn't say thank you. Fallon wouldn't say thank you. Fallon would expect it. He pushed the front doors open. The foyer was massive, floored in stark black and white checkerboard marble that echoed aggressively with every step. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling like a frozen explosion. Several people were waiting in the hall. 2 men in dark suits, leaning against a banister, straightened up immediately as they entered. A woman in a dark maid's uniform stood near the archway, leading to the kitchen. "Boss," one of the suited men said, nodding respectfully. Then his eyes slid to Fiona. The color completely drained from the man's face. He took a half step backward, his hand twitching toward his jacket before he forced it down. Fiona watched the reaction. It wasn't just surprise. It was absolute, unfiltered terror. She turned her gaze to the maid. The older woman visibly flinched, dropping her chin to her chest, her hands trembling as she smoothed her apron. She looked like a rabbit staring down the barrel of a shotgun. "What did you do to these people, Fallon?" Fiona thought, acid churning in the back of her throat. "Everyone," the man beside her announced, his voice carrying effortlessly through the cavernous space. "My wife has decided to return from her sabbatical. Treat her with the exact level of respect she has earned." The silence that followed was suffocating. It was heavy with hatred and fear. "I'm tired, Ronan," Fiona said. The name tasted foreign, wrong, but she had seen it on a piece of mail sitting on the dashboard of the car. Ronan Gallagher. She prayed it was his first name, and not an associate's. He looked at her, an eyebrow creeping upward. "Ronan? We're back to using given names, are we? How domestic. Let's go upstairs, darling. You smell like old grease, and it's giving me a headache." He gestured toward the sweeping staircase. Fiona walked up, forcing herself to place one foot in front of the other without hurrying. Running would show fear. She felt his heavy gaze on her back, analyzing every shift of her hips, every placement of her feet. He led her into a master suite that was as cold and imposing as the rest of the house. Gunmetal grey walls, heavy velvet drapes, and a massive king-sized bed dominated the room. The air felt sterile, devoid of any personal touches. No photographs, no clutter, just expensive furniture and shadows. Ronan walked to a heavy oak dresser and unclasped his watch, letting it hit the wood with a sharp clink. He began unbuttoning his suit jacket. "The safe combination has been changed. Don't bother looking for the passports. The border guards are on my payroll anyway." He took off his jacket and tossed it onto a chair. Underneath, his white dress shirt stretched tight across his shoulders. Fiona stood in the center of the room, feeling small and ridiculous in her thrift store clothes. "Where are my things?" she asked, trying to project irritation instead of the blinding panic that was currently squeezing her lungs. Ronan pointed to a set of double doors. "Your closet is exactly as you left it. Take a shower, Fallon. Wash that ridiculous color out of your hair if you can. Then we are going to have a very long conversation about where my $3 million went." Fiona walked to the closet. She closed the doors behind her and slumped against the dark mahogany wood. The closet was the size of her entire apartment. Racks of designer dresses, rows of impossibly high stilettos, and glass displays of jewelry surrounded her. It smelled of expensive perfume and leather. She slid down the door until she was sitting on the plush carpet, pulling her knees to her chest. She dug her nails into her arms, trying to ground herself. "Breathe," She was locked in a fortress with a Mafia boss who wanted his money back, a husband who hated his wife but was possessive enough to hunt her down. She didn't know the safe combination. She didn't know where the money was. She didn't even know how Fallon took her coffee. Fiona stood up. She stripped off her cheap clothes, leaving them in a pathetic pile on the floor. She walked into the adjoining master bathroom, a monstrosity of white marble and brass fixtures. She turned the shower on as hot as it would go, stepping under the spray. She scrubbed her skin until it was red, washing away the diner grease, the alleyway dirt, and the lingering scent of Ronan's chloroform. When she stepped out, she wrapped herself in a thick white towel. She went back to the closet and found a silk robe hanging on a velvet hook. It was deep emerald green, the fabric heavy and slippery. It felt cold against her skin, clinging in ways she wasn't used to. It felt like armor. It felt like a lie. She took a deep breath, tied the sash tightly around her waist, and opened the door to face her new husband. Ronan was sitting on the edge of the bed, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. He looked up as she walked in. His eyes tracked the movement of the emerald silk against her legs, lingering just a second too long before snapping back up to her face. The look wasn't loving. It was analytical, dissecting her geometry. "You look different," he noted quietly, taking a slow sip of his drink. Fiona's heart skipped a beat, but she forced her jaw to remain relaxed. 4 months on the run tends to age a person. It's not just the cheap dye job. He tilted his head, watching her with predatory stillness. "You're holding your shoulders differently. And you didn't throw anything at my head when I insulted your clothes downstairs. Have you found religion, Fallon? Or are you just heavily medicated?" "I'm tired," Fiona replied, walking to a vanity mirror across the room and sitting down. She avoided his reflection in the glass. "Exhaustion makes you practical. Throwing things is a waste of energy." Ronan chuckled softly, the ice in his glass clinking. "Practical? Right. The woman who set fire to the East Wing because she didn't like the wallpaper is suddenly practical." Fiona closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. Set fire to the East Wing. She was impersonating a psychopath. "People change," she managed, picking up a silver hairbrush from the vanity and running it through her damp hair. "People adapt," Ronan corrected. He stood up, the mattress sighing as he shifted his weight. He walked up behind her. Fiona's muscles locked as his large frame filled the mirror behind her. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a physical weight. "They adapt to survive. You're playing a new angle. I just haven't figured out what it is yet." He leaned down, his face hovering just above her shoulder, the smell of whiskey mixed with the lingering vetiver. "Sleep well, wife. The doors are locked from the outside. Don't try the windows. It's a 3-story drop to the flagstones." He walked away, leaving the room through a side door that led to what Fiona assumed was an adjoining suite or study. The heavy lock clicked shut with a brutal finality. Fiona exhaled a long, shuddering breath and collapsed forward onto the vanity. Morning arrived with the harsh, grey light of a coming snowstorm. Fiona hadn't slept. She had spent the night curled on top of the silk bedspread, fully robed, staring at the ceiling and running through every memory she had of Fallon. Fallon was sharp. Fallon was cruel. Fallon laughed when other people cried. At 8 a.m., the heavy bedroom door unlocked with a loud clack. The maid from the night before, Marta, entered, pushing a silver cart. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, her knuckles white where they gripped the handle. Fiona sat up, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. "Good morning," she said automatically, her voice rough from lack of use. Marta froze. The cart rattled slightly as the older woman's hands shook. She looked up, her eyes wide with fresh panic. I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to wake you. I can leave. I'll take it back." Fiona realized her mistake immediately. Fallon wouldn't say good morning. Fallon wouldn't acknowledge a servant as a human being. Muscle memory forced Fiona's jaw shut. She had to correct it, or word would get back to Ronan that she was acting soft. Softness invited suspicion. Suspicion meant death. "Leave the cart," Fiona snapped, pushing her voice down an octave, scraping it with irritation. "And stop shaking, it's pathetic. Get out!" The words tasted like poison on her tongue. Marta nodded frantically, releasing the cart and backing out of the room as if escaping a tiger enclosure. The door clicked shut. Fiona squeezed her eyes shut, a wave of self-disgust washing over her. She hated herself. She hated the necessity of the cruelty. She walked over to the cart. Black coffee in a silver pot, a single grapefruit cut in half, and dry toast. It was a starvation diet. Fiona's stomach, used to heavy diner breakfasts, growled violently. She poured the coffee. It was pitch black and smelled like roasted ash. She took a sip. The bitterness coated her tongue, scalding the roof of her mouth. She forced herself to swallow it without wincing. An hour later, an enforcer arrived to escort her downstairs. Fiona had raided Fallon's closet, forcing herself into a pair of tailored black wool trousers and a crimson silk blouse that felt entirely too thin for the drafty house. She applied makeup from the vanity, mimicking the sharp, dramatic eyeliner she remembered Fallon wearing in high school. War paint. She was led to a massive dining room. Ronan was sitting at the head of a long, polished oak table. Two men stood near the walls. Papers were scattered across the wood. Ronan didn't look up from a ledger he was reading. "Sit." Fiona took the chair to his right. The leather groaned beneath her. "We have a problem," Ronan said smoothly, finally closing the ledger. He looked at her, his eyes unreadable. Dimitri intercepted a shipment at the docks last night. He claims he thought it was an unapproved run by a lower-level crew, but he held back 20 crates of rifles, kept them for himself. Fiona stared at him, trying to keep her face a blank mask. Why was he telling her this? "Dimitri is one of our best earners," Ronan continued, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. "But a thief is a thief. The traditional penalty is a bullet in the back of the head. However, killing him disrupts the southern ports." Ronan tilted his head, his dark eyes boring into hers. "You've always had a creative mind for punishment, Fallon. What do you think we should do?" It was a test. A blatant, dangerous test. Fiona's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Dimitri. A man's life. If she said spare him, Ronan would know she wasn't Fallon. If she said kill him, she would be ordering an execution. She forced herself to think like a monster. What is worse than death to a greedy man? What would Fallon do? Fiona leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. She let her gaze sweep over the two enforcers before locking eyes with Ronan. She channeled every ounce of anger she felt at being kidnapped, at being forced into this nightmare, and pushed it into her voice. "A bullet is too quick," Fiona said, her voice eerily calm, the crimson silk of her blouse catching the dull light. "He stole from you to build his own arsenal. He wants power. So take it all." She paused, letting the silence stretch, calculating the weight of her words. Strip him of his territory, seize his personal accounts, leave him alive, but make sure every crew in the city knows he's nothing but a beggar now. Let him starve in the streets he used to run. Death makes him a martyr. Humiliation makes him a cautionary tale. The room went dead silent. The enforcers exchanged a quick, nervous glance. Ronan stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. His jaw flexed. Then, a slow, dark smile spread across his face. It was the first time she had seen him look genuinely pleased. Humiliation, Ronan murmured, tasting the word. Brilliant, vicious, and entirely lacking in mercy. I missed that sharp mind of yours, my love. He reached over and briefly laid his heavy hand over hers. His skin was warm, a sharp contrast to the cold dread settling in Fiona's stomach. She didn't pull away. She just stared at his hand, feeling the trap closing tighter around her. She had passed the test, and in doing so, she had damned herself. Silence in the Gallagher estate carried a physical weight. It pressed against Fiona's eardrums as she wandered the second-floor corridor, her bare feet sinking into the thick Persian runners. She had spent 3 days playing a ghost, 3 days of wearing Fallon's armor, stiff silk blouses, tailored trousers that pinched her waist, and a mask of perpetual, icy boredom. She needed a phone. She needed a computer. She needed a sliver of the outside world to prove she still existed. Fiona pushed open the heavy oak doors to the library. The air inside smelled of beeswax polish, old paper, and a lingering trace of sour cigar smoke. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held thousands of leather-bound spines. It was a beautiful room, entirely wasted on men who solved problems with crowbars and bullet casings. She moved quickly, trailing her fingers over the smooth expanse of a massive mahogany desk. No landline, no laptop, just a brass letter opener and a stack of ledgers written in a cipher she couldn't comprehend. She opened the top drawer. Locked. She yanked on the brass handle of the second drawer. Locked. Frustration bubbled up in her throat, hot and sharp, tasting vaguely metallic. She kicked the bottom of the desk, the soft thud absorbed entirely by the heavy wood. "Looking for the petty cash, darling?" Fiona spun around, her heart violently knocking against her ribs. Ronan stood in the doorway. He had discarded his suit jacket. His sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, exposing forearms corded with dense muscle, and a faded, jagged scar that snaked over his right wrist. He held a crystal tumbler, the ice clinking softly against the glass, as he took a slow step into the room. "I was looking for a book," Fiona lied, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the violent tremor in her knees. She grabbed a random volume from the nearest shelf and held it up. It was a heavy first edition of something dense and Russian. Ronan walked toward her. He didn't rush. He moved with the lazy, terrifying grace of a predator that knew all the exits were already sealed. He stopped inches from her, the heat radiating off his large body, cutting through the drafty chill of the library. He reached out and took the book from her hand. He didn't even glance at the title. He just looked at her. "You hate Russian literature," he said quietly. He tossed the book onto the desk. It landed with a heavy, final thwack. "You said it was too depressing for people who already lived in the dark." Fiona swallowed hard, forcing her throat to work. "I've decided to broaden my horizons." Ronan stepped closer. Fiona's back hit the edge of the mahogany desk. There was nowhere to retreat. He braced his hands on the wood on either side of her hips, caging her in. He smelled like expensive, peaty scotch, clean sweat, and that omnipresent, sharp vetiver. "You are an enigma this week, Fallon." He lowered his head, his nose brushing the curve of her jaw. Fiona froze, every muscle in her body locking down into rigid terror. She expected violence. She expected his hands to move to her throat. Instead, he inhaled slowly. "You don't smell like gunpowder and Chanel anymore. You smell like soap, cheap, unscented soap." "I ran out of perfume," she whispered, staring straight ahead at the crisp white collar of his shirt, refusing to look up into his dark eyes. "You never run out." Ronan's voice dropped to a gravelly murmur. He lifted a hand, tracing the line of her jaw with the back of his knuckles. The touch was incredibly gentle, utterly contradicting the lethal reputation of the man delivering it. It confused her senses. It made her stomach twist with a complicated, nauseating mixture of terror and an odd, unwanted warmth. Her breath hitched, an imperfect, raw sound escaping her lips before she could bite it back. He stepped back suddenly, the spell breaking like shattered glass. He picked up his tumbler, his expression smoothing over into a mask of total indifference. "Dinner is in 20 minutes. Wear something decent. We have a guest." He turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. Fiona gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles turning white, gasping for air as if she had just been pulled from deep water. Porcelain clattered against silver. The dining room was suffocatingly formal. Fiona sat opposite Ronan, staring at a plate of perfectly seared scallops that tasted like rubber in her dry mouth. The guest was a man named Sullivan. He was older, with a florid, pockmarked face, thinning grey hair, and eyes that darted nervously around the room. He was a distributor, someone who moved Gallagher product across state lines, and he was sweating profusely, the sheen catching the light from the chandelier. "The margins are tight, Ronan," Sullivan blustered, dabbing his damp forehead with a heavy linen napkin. "The new customs agents are tearing apart every third truck. We need to reroute through the northern corridor." Ronan cut a piece of steak, his face a portrait of calm indifference. "The northern corridor costs 30% more in bribes. You're asking me to take a hit because you can't manage your own drivers." "It's not the drivers," Sullivan protested, his voice pitching higher in a panic. He looked directly at Fiona, desperately seeking an ally. "Fallon, tell him. You remember the mess in 2022. You were the one who negotiated the northern route in the first place." Fiona's fork paused halfway to her mouth. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet 10 degrees. Ronan stopped chewing. He placed his knife down on the fine china plate with a precise, sharp click. He shifted his gaze to Fiona. Waiting. She didn't know anything about a northern route. She didn't know who Fallon had bribed, what the margins were, or what happened in 2022. She was a bookkeeper who audited suburban dental practices. "The landscape has changed since 22, Sullivan," Fiona said carefully. She forced her voice to stay low and dismissive, channeling the cruelest tone she could muster. She set her fork down and picked up her crystal wine glass, focusing heavily on the dark red liquid inside to avoid looking at the sweating man. "Relying on old deals is how you get indicted." Sullivan blinked, completely taken aback. "But you swore by the northern route. You said the border guards up there were practically on retainer. People retire. People get greedy." Fiona took a slow sip of the wine. It was overwhelmingly dry and heavily tannic, coating her tongue in bitterness. "Find a new solution, or Ronan will find a new distributor." Ronan's eyes narrowed slightly, a microscopic shift in the muscles around his eyes. He picked up his glass. "My wife is right. Fix the southern route, Sullivan, or we restructure." The rest of the dinner passed in agonizing, tense silence. When Sullivan finally excused himself, practically running to his car in the gravel driveway, Fiona stood up from the table. Her legs felt like lead. She just wanted the sanctuary of her locked bedroom. "Sit down." The command wasn't loud, but it cracked through the empty dining room like a whip. Fiona froze. Her heart skipped a beat, and she slowly lowered herself back into the leather-backed chair. Ronan poured himself another glass of wine. He didn't offer her any. He stared at her from the opposite end of the table, his dark eyes stripping away her flimsy defenses, layer by layer. "You handled Sullivan well," he said. The compliment sounded exactly like a threat. "He's an idiot," Fiona replied, crossing her arms over her chest to hide the sudden trembling in her fingers. "He is." Ronan stood up. He walked slowly around the long table, his footsteps making no sound on the thick rug, until he was standing directly behind her chair. Fiona clamped her hands together, tightly in her lap. But he was right about one thing, Ronan murmured, leaning down so his mouth was hovering just beside her ear. You did negotiate the northern route. You spent 3 weeks in freezing motels buttering up border guards. He reached over her shoulder. Before she could pull away, he grabbed her right hand, pulling it up from her lap and holding it flat under the harsh, unsparing light of the chandelier. Fiona stopped breathing. Ronan's thumb rubbed firmly over the tips of her fingers, tracing the smooth, unremarkable skin. He then ran his thumb over the side of her middle and index fingers, feeling the heavy, thick calluses formed by years of gripping a cheap ballpoint pen and pounding away on a 10-key desktop calculator. Funny thing about the northern route, Ronan whispered softly, his grip on her wrist tightening just enough to cause a dull throb of pain. You had a slight disagreement with a rival crew while you were up there. One of them pinned your hand to a table with a combat knife. Fiona stared down at her own hand. Unblemished, scar-free. The blade went right through the webbing between your thumb and index finger, Ronan continued, his voice terrifyingly steady and cold. It took 12 stitches, left a nasty, puckered scar. He dropped her hand. It hit the edge of the mahogany table with a dull thud. Ronan moved to stand directly in front of her. The exhaustion in his eyes was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating fury that sucked all the oxygen out of the room. He braced his hands on the arms of her chair, trapping her. "Where is the scar, Fallon?" he asked, the silence in the room pressing down on them. And more importantly, why do your hands feel like they belong to someone who has never fired a gun in her life? Panic seized her throat like a physical hand, squeezing until her vision blurred at the edges. Fiona stared at the pale, unscarred skin of her own hand, resting limply on the dark wood of the dining table. The silence in the room stretched until it felt brittle enough to snap. Ronan didn't yell. He didn't pull a weapon. His stillness was infinitely worse. He leaned closer, his eyes mapping every microscopic twitch of her facial muscles, every frantic pulse beating against the delicate skin of her neck. "I told you," Fiona choked out. Her voice was a pathetic, broken rasp. She squeezed her eyes shut, unable to bear the searing intensity of his gaze. "I told you in the car. I told you in the alley. Open your eyes." The command was soft, but it carried the weight of an anvil. Fiona obeyed, her eyelashes wet with involuntary tears. Ronan slowly straightened up, his towering frame casting a long, distorted shadow across the china and crystal. He dragged a hand down his face, the sound of his palm against his jaw loud in the dead quiet. For the first time since she had been thrown into the back of his armored sedan, the impenetrable mask of the ruthless boss slipped. He looked profoundly, dangerously confused. "Fiona," he said, testing the syllables. He tasted the name as if it were a strange, bitter vintage. A twin. She actually has a twin. "We haven't spoken in 6 years, Fiona blurted out, the words tumbling over each other in a desperate bid to keep him from acting on whatever violent calculations were running behind his dark eyes. "She left when our mother got sick. I stayed. I paid the medical bills. I work at an accounting firm. I buy generic brand cereal. I don't know anything about guns, or safe combinations, or northern routes. Please just look at my hands again." She held them up, shaking violently. These are the hands of someone who types 70 words a minute, not someone who stabs people. Ronan stared at her trembling fingers. He took a slow step backward, bracing his own hands on his hips. He looked toward the ceiling, exhaling a long, sharp breath. $3 million, he murmured to the empty air. A dark, cynical chuckle vibrated in his chest. She didn't just steal the money. She left a breadcrumb trail, a sloppy, obvious trail right to a diner in the city. He looked back down at Fiona, his expression hardening into something jagged and cold. She knew I would track the scent. She knew my men would grab the first woman who looked exactly like my wife. The realization hit Fiona with the force of a physical blow. Her stomach bottomed out, acid burning the back of her throat. Fallon hadn't just vanished. Fallon had offered her up as a sacrifice. Her own sister had used her as a decoy, a fleshy speed bump to slow down a monster, buying herself a 4-month head start to disappear with a small fortune. Fiona clamped a hand over her mouth. A ragged, terrible sound tore out of her throat, a half sob, half laugh that tasted like bile. She bent forward, pressing her forehead against the cool edge of the mahogany table, trying to ground herself as the room spun. Her lungs seized. The betrayal was so profound, so entirely calculating, it fractured something fundamental inside her chest. "Breathe," Ronan ordered sharply. She couldn't. She was hyperventilating, the edges of the room turning a muddy, swimming grey. The crisp silk of her borrowed crimson blouse felt like a straitjacket. Heavy footsteps closed the distance. Rough hands grabbed her shoulders, hauling her upright. Ronan pushed her head down between her knees. "Breathe, damn it! I am not having you pass out on my floor," Fiona gasped, pulling the scent of his vetiver cologne deep into her lungs. It was an awful irony that the smell of her kidnapper was the only thing anchoring her to reality. She forced her chest to expand, fighting the panic attack with the stubborn, deeply ingrained practicality of a woman used to surviving on scraped-together pennies. After 5 agonizing minutes, the shaking subsided into a dull, exhausted tremor. She sat up slowly. Ronan was standing a few feet away, watching her with a clinical detachment that made her skin crawl. He had poured himself a glass of water and set it on the table near her elbow. He didn't offer it. He simply left it there. "Drink," he instructed. Fiona reached for the crystal glass. It was incredibly heavy. She managed a sip, the freezing water shocking her system. She wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist, discarding the elegant linen napkin entirely. "What now?" she asked, her voice hollow. She looked up at him, stripping away the pathetic attempt at Fallon's haughty sneer. She was just Fiona now, small, terrified, and entirely at his mercy. "Do you kill me because I know your face?" Ronan leaned against the back of his chair, crossing his arms. "Killing you yields 0 return on investment. It doesn't get my money back. It doesn't solve the problem of my missing wife." "Then let me go. I can't do that either." He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "You're a liability, but you're also an asset. Fallon thinks she's brilliant. She thinks she bought herself total freedom by feeding you to the wolves. But Fallon has a fatal flaw." Fiona frowned, her brows drawing together. "What?" "Ego," Ronan said softly. "She won't be able to resist checking in. She'll want to know if I killed you. She'll want to know if her little trap worked. And when she looks..." His lips curved into a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "She's going to see you standing right by my side." Midnight swallowed the Gallagher estate, turning the sprawling house into a tomb of shadows and drafty corridors. Fiona sat in a high-backed leather chair in Ronan's private study, a heavy wool blanket draped over her shivering shoulders. The study was functional and ruthless. Dark oak panels, a massive steel safe built directly into the masonry, and a desk practically groaning under the weight of ledgers and burner phones. The air smelled of metallic gun oil and strong, black coffee. Ronan sat behind the desk, methodically cleaning a matte black handgun. The rhythmic, metallic snick-clack of the slide being racked set Fiona's teeth on edge. He wasn't doing it to intimidate her, which somehow made it infinitely worse. It was just a chore to him, like doing the dishes, The rules of your survival are simple, Ronan stated, not looking up from the weapon. He wiped down the barrel with a grease-stained rag. To me, behind closed doors, you are Fiona. You are a civilian who got caught in the crossfire. I will not hurt you. He paused, looking up. His dark eyes caught the dim light of the desk lamp, glinting like chipped obsidian. But outside this room, to the staff? To my men? To the rival crews trying to carve up my territory? You are Fallon Gallagher. You are a woman who once broke a man's jaw with an ashtray because he spoke out of turn. Fiona pulled the blanket tighter, the coarse wool scratching against her collarbone. Why? If you know she's gone, why keep up the charade? Because this organization runs on fear and stability, Ronan answered flatly, sliding a heavy magazine into the grip with a sharp, decisive click. He set the gun down on the blotter. If my men find out my wife robbed me blind and disappeared, they will smell weakness. Weakness invites challengers. Challengers invite a war. I am not fighting a war over $3 million and a treacherous spouse. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. More importantly, we are going to use you to flush her out. We are going to parade you around. We are going to make sure the street whispers that Fallon Gallagher is back, firmly in power and thriving. It will drive her insane. Fiona stared at the dark metal of the gun on the desk. She was trapped. She was no longer just a hostage. She was an active participant in a lethal chess match. I can't be her, Fiona whispered, the truth tasting like ash. You saw me at dinner. Sullivan almost caught me. I don't know the roots. I don't know the names. I don't know the history. Someone is going to figure it out. And when they do, they'll put a bullet in my head. Ronan opened a deep side drawer of his desk. He pulled out a thick, black leather binder and tossed it across the polished wood. It slid to a stop directly in front of Fiona. Then you better study, he said. Fiona reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing the cold leather. She flipped it open. It was a dossier. Pages of photographs, names, organizational charts, and handwritten notes detailing violent encounters, bribes, and leverage. It was a textbook on how to be a monster. Your sister is a sociopath, Ronan said conversationally, picking up a pen and signing a document on his desk. She has a photographic memory for grievances. She drinks her scotch neat. She prefers intimidation to negotiation, and she considers empathy a biological defect. You need to strip away everything that makes you a quiet, decent bookkeeper and find the coldest, ugliest part of your soul. Fiona turned a page. There was a photo of a man with a shattered knee lying in a pool of dark blood. A note in Fallon's elegant, looping handwriting read, "Paid his debt." Reminded him about interest. Bile rose in Fiona's throat again. She forced it down. She looked at Ronan, really looked at him. The exhaustion around his eyes, the rigid set of his jaw. He was chained to this life just as much as she was now chained to him. You married her, Fiona said quietly, the observation slipping out before she could filter it. You married a sociopath. What does that make you? The scratching of his pen stopped. The silence in the study grew heavy, pressing against her eardrums. Ronan slowly raised his head. For a fraction of a second, something raw and painfully human flickered behind the impenetrable darkness of his eyes. A ghost of regret, perhaps, or the weariness of a man who realized too late he had invited a viper into his bed. It makes me the devil she sold her soul to, Ronan replied, his voice dropping to a gravelly, dangerous pitch. He stood up, towering over the desk. Read the file, Fiona. Your education begins tomorrow. At 10 o'clock, we are going to a sit-down with the waterfront union bosses. If you hesitate, If you show an ounce of the woman trembling under that blanket, we both lose. He walked to the door, pulling it open. The dark, cavernous hallway beckoned. "Good night, wife," he threw over his shoulder, the word dripping with heavy sarcasm. The door clicked shut, the sound echoing like a prison cell locking into place. Fiona was left alone in the dim light, staring at the manual of her sister's sins. She traced the harsh angles of Fallon's handwriting. She had spent her entire life trying to be nothing like her twin. She paid her taxes. She smiled at strangers. She lived in quiet, invisible desperation. Now, her survival depended on becoming the nightmare she had always run from. Fiona took a deep breath, the smell of gun oil settling deep in her lungs. She pulled the binder closer, turned to the first page, and began to read. Diesel fumes burned the back of her throat, mixing with the sharp, rotting stench of low tide. Fiona stepped out of the black SUV, her leather-soled boots hitting the cracked concrete of Pier 42 with a definitive thud. November wind whipped off the grey, churning harbour water, slicing straight through the heavy, tailored charcoal trench coat Ronan had laid out for her that morning. Kevlar lining, he had mentioned casually over black coffee. Bulletproof. It weighed heavily on her shoulders, a physical reminder of the target painted on her back. Ronan flanked her right side. He wore no overcoat, just a dark suit that absorbed the bleak morning light. His presence was a gravitational pull, forcing the half-dozen dock workers lingering near the chain-link fence to avert their eyes, and suddenly find immense interest in the toes of their steel-toed boots. Fiona locked her jaw, forcing the tremor out of her hands by shoving them deep into the fleece-aligned pockets of the coat. She had spent the entire night reading Fallon's black binder. She had memorized names, grudges, supply chains, and cruelties. Her brain felt overstuffed, wired with an ugly, jagged energy. "Walk slightly ahead of me," Ronan murmured, his lips barely moving. "You are the emissary today. I am just the muscle enforcing your will. Don't look at the water. Look at the corrugated warehouse door." Fiona obeyed. She lengthened her stride, ignoring the pinch of her expensive boots. Inside Warehouse 7, the air was stagnant, reeking of wet cardboard and old fish scales. A single high-wattage bulb hung from the rusted rafters, casting harsh, downward shadows over a folding card table. 3 men sat around it. The man in the center was Patrick Donnelly, head of the Longshoremen's Union. He was a barrel-chested man with a red, pockmarked face and eyes that looked like wet stones. According to Fallon's notes, Donnelly had a severe gambling addiction, a mistress in a neighboring state, and a tendency to skim 3% off the top of the Gallagher shipping crates. Donnelly didn't stand when they approached. He leaned back in his squeaking metal chair, lighting a cheap cigar. The acrid smoke drifted toward them. "Ronan," Donnelly grunted, pointedly ignoring Fiona. "Didn't expect a personal visit. We already sent the envelope for the month." Ronan stopped a few feet from the table, clasping his hands in front of him. He looked at Fiona. The stage was hers. Fiona swallowed the lump of pure, unadulterated terror lodged in her esophagus. She channeled the exhaustion of the past 4 days, the anger of being kidnapped, the profound betrayal of her own twin sister, and forged it into a spear. She stepped up to the table. She didn't raise her voice. She kept it flat, hollow, and devoid of basic human warmth. "The envelope was light, Patrick," Fiona said. Donnelly finally looked at her. He offered a patronizing, yellow-toothed smile. "Fallon, good to see the missus out and about. But union dues went up. Cost of doing business at the port. The envelope is exactly what we agreed upon last quarter." Fiona placed both hands flat on the rusted metal of the folding table, leaning into his space. She held his gaze. Her stomach churned violently, begging her to back down, but she forced herself to stare at the deep pores on his nose. "We didn't agree to fund your baccarat habit," she said softly. The smile dropped off Donnelly's face like a stone. The two men flanking him shifted uncomfortably, their hands moving closer to the lapels of their jackets. Behind her, Fiona heard the subtle, terrifying rustle of Ronan shifting his weight, prepping for violence. "I don't know what you're talking about," Donnelly growled, a defensive edge sharpening his tone. Fiona tapped her manicured index finger against the table. 1, 2, 3. Table maximums at the Grand in Atlantic City. You dropped 80,000 last weekend. You skimmed our crates to cover your marker. If you want to steal from my husband to feed a sickness, that's your funeral. But doing it when you still owe the remaining balance on your mistress's condo? That's just bad math, Patrick. Complete, suffocating silence descended on the warehouse. The only sound was the distant screech of a seagull and the heavy thud of Donnelly's heart rate accelerating. He stared at her, his florid face draining of color, leaving a sickly, mottled gray. He looked past her, seeking mercy from Ronan. Ronan offered none. He merely tilted his head, watching Fiona with an expression of dark, predatory approval. "The shortfall will be in my husband's hands. By midnight," Fiona continued, pushing away from the table. She brushed a speck of imaginary dust from her sleeve, mimicking a gesture she had seen Fallon do 100 times. "If it isn't, I won't send Ronan's men to collect. I'll send your wife the mortgage papers for the condo in Boca. Then, I'll let the casino collectors break your legs. Are we clear?" Donnelly swallowed audibly. "Clear. It'll be there." Fiona turned on her heel and walked out. She didn't look back to see if Ronan was following. She pushed through the heavy warehouse door, stepping back out into the biting wind. By the time she reached the SUV, her knees gave out. She caught herself on the door handle, her breath hitching in ragged, uncontrolled gasps. The adrenaline crashed, leaving a toxic, shaking weakness in its wake. She had just threatened a man's life. She had weaponized his secrets. She had done it well. Ronan's large hand wrapped around her elbow, steadying her. He opened the heavy armored door and guided her into the passenger seat. He didn't speak until he was behind the wheel, the engine purring to life and locking out the cold. He looked at her, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel. The exhaustion in his eyes had receded, replaced by a complex, guarded respect. "You didn't blink," he observed quietly. Fiona leaned her head back against the headrest, staring blankly at the grey fabric of the ceiling. "I feel sick. I feel absolutely sick to my stomach." "That means you're still human," Ronan said. He shifted the car into drive, pulling away from the docks. Fallon would have shot one of his men just to punctuate the sentence. "You got the money back without a single drop of blood." Fiona closed her eyes. The praise felt dirty. It felt like a trap. Don't act like we're a team. I'm your hostage. I did what I had to do so you wouldn't put me in the ground." Ronan didn't argue. He just drove, the silence stretching between them, no longer suffocating, but heavy with the terrifying realization that she was entirely capable of wearing the monster's skin. 3 weeks blurred into a monotonous, high-stakes nightmare. Fiona attended dinners, sat in on territory negotiations, and smiled coldly at men who quietly calculated how long it would take to dispose of her body. She lived entirely inside the black binder. She became a database of human leverage. The staff at the estate stopped trembling when she entered a room, their sheer terror replaced by a wary, confused caution. She didn't throw plates. She didn't fire the gardener for planting the wrong shade of hydrangeas. She was still demanding, but the unpredictable, malicious cruelty of the real Fallon was absent. Late one Tuesday evening, Fiona sat in the library, a glass of untouched bourbon sweating onto a coaster beside her. A heavy rain battered the tall windows, obscuring the sprawling grounds in a sheet of dark water. She was auditing the monthly ledger for the southern routes. The numbers were entirely fabricated, heavily padded to hide a massive deficit. Someone was bleeding Ronan dry from the inside. The heavy oak doors clicked open. Ronan stepped in, carrying a small, plain, brown cardboard box. His suit jacket was damp, his hair plastered against his forehead. He looked lethal. He didn't say a word. He walked to the desk, pulled a folding knife from his pocket, and sliced through the packing tape. He tipped the box over. A single object tumbled out, hitting the mahogany with a soft, dull clatter. Fiona stared at it. It was a cheap, plastic hair clip. Neon pink, shaped like a butterfly. One of the antennae was snapped off. Her lungs seized. All the air evaporated from the library. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, her voice cracking. She didn't reach for it. She physically recoiled, pressing her back flush against the leather chair. "It arrived at one of my front businesses downtown," Ronan said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He pulled a piece of thick, cream-colored cardstock from the box and placed it next to the clip. "Addressed directly to you." Fiona forced her eyes to the card. It bore 3 words, written in that elegant, looping, sociopathic handwriting she had spent weeks studying. "Nice coat, sister." The butterfly clip. It was hers. It was the clip she had used to hold her mousy brown hair back the night she was abducted in the alleyway behind the diner. Fallon hadn't just used her as a decoy. She had stayed close enough to watch the kidnapping happen. She had retrieved the dropped clip from the greasy asphalt. Fiona squeezed her eyes shut, pressing the heels of her hands against her temples. A low, wretched sound escaped her throat. "She's watching. She knows I'm here. She knows I'm playing her. She knows the street believes she's back," Ronan corrected, pulling a chair out and sitting across from her. He leaned forward, his forearms resting on the edge of the desk. "She's losing her leverage. Her ghost story is falling apart because you are taking up the physical space she abandoned. This," he gestured to the clip, "is a temper tantrum. It's proof that our strategy is working." "It's proof that she's a psychopath," Fiona snapped, her temper finally fracturing the icy facade she had maintained for nearly a month. She slammed her hand down on the ledger. "She wants me dead, Ronan. If your men find out I'm an imposter, they kill me. If Fallon decides I'm too much of an inconvenience, she kills me. I am sitting in a cage, waiting for the executioner to draw a number." Ronan stared at her, absorbing her panic without flinching. Slowly he reached across the desk. He didn't grab her wrist or grip her jaw like he used to. He simply laid his large, scarred hand flat over hers, anchoring her to the wood. The heat of his skin sent a complicated, unwanted shockwave up her arm. "No one is going to kill you, Fiona," he said. The use of her real name in the open, even within the locked walls of the library, felt like an electric charge. "I have 50 men guarding the perimeter of this estate. I have eyes on every transit hub in the city. When she makes her move, and she will, because her ego won't allow her to be replaced, we will catch her." Fiona looked down at his hand, covering hers. She should pull away. He was a criminal. He was the reason she was in this nightmare. But the quiet, absolute certainty in his voice was the only solid ground she had left in a world built on quicksand. "And when you catch her?" Fiona asked quietly, lifting her gaze to meet his dark, fathomless eyes. "What happens to me?" Ronan's jaw flexed. For a long moment, the silence was broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain against the glass. He slowly withdrew his hand, the loss of contact leaving her skin cold. We cross that bridge when we drag her back over it, he answered evasively. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. Keep auditing those ledgers. I want to know exactly who is stealing from me before the sun comes up. He walked out, leaving the neon pink butterfly clip sitting perfectly between them. The game had fundamentally changed. Fallon wasn't just a ghost running with stolen money anymore. She was a sniper, settling into position. And Fiona was standing directly in the crosshairs. Fiona is playing a dangerous game. But has she finally backed her sociopathic twin into a corner? The stakes are higher than ever, and Ronan's true intentions remain a mystery. If you are hooked on this twisted dynamic and want to see the explosive confrontation when Fallon finally steps out of the shadows, smash that like button. Share this video with a friend who loves dark, suspenseful drama, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the thrilling conclusion in the next parts. Tell us in the comments, who is playing who?